brought up with me a set of scales. For a long time, of course, scales were used as a method of measurement in the marketplace, right? A way to make sure you're getting what you're owed. You want to be sure that you get what you paid for, and they want to make sure that you're paying for what you're getting. And so scales were used as a way to make sure everything was fair. In more recent years, I think we would associate this symbol of scales with justice. Like if you go to the Department of Justice in DC, there's a statue, an image of statue, Lady Justice. Can you picture her? She's got the blindfold on and she's holding out the scales. And it's meant to communicate that, look, no matter what you look like or where you're from, no matter what your story or background might be, that ideally, we live by the scales. That everyone gets what they deserve. That's kind of the scale approach to life, that you put your life and your decisions, all the good and all the bad, and you see how it comes out. Everybody gets what they deserve. But what's interesting is if you take this image of scales and Lady Justice, and you trace it back, you can trace this back to ancient Rome. When I was in Rome about a week and a half ago, I spent some time studying some of the gods and the goddesses that they worshiped in first century Rome, and it's kind of amazing to see the parallels to what would be our modern day idols in the Western world. But one of the goddesses I studied about was the goddess that was known as Justitia. And the image that you see of Lady Justice is basically that goddess. They worshiped the goddess of justice who held the scales. In fact, when Jesus was alive, Tiberius became emperor of Rome, and he built a temple to the goddess Justitia, where people could go and worship the scales. That's how seriously they took the scales. And so the scale approach to life is pretty popular these days for us. That's how most of us approach our worth, our value, other people's worth and their value. It's how we tend to approach and evaluate ourselves. It's how we tend to evaluate people that we work with or who work for us or who we work for. Everybody has a way of getting put on the scales eventually. And I think we like this well enough when it's the Department of Justice. But like, if this was the symbol for your home growing up, like if you had a mom or a dad that put you on the scales and you just never felt like you were measuring up, never good enough. Like some of you, it's been decades since you lived under the same roof with mom and dad, but like you are living your life driven by the scales, trying to somehow do enough good, trying to somehow earn favor and love. And just to hear, I'm proud of you, you want to hear that because it felt like during those formative years, you just couldn't get there. Or for some of you, this would be the symbol of your marriage, where it feels like your best is never enough. You're trying hard, but you don't really know what unconditional love looks like because as hard as you try, it feels like you're still letting your spouse down. Like that's the one thing you're really good at is disappointing your spouse. And it just becomes exhausting to the point where maybe that pressure has caused you to withdraw and you don't even really try anymore. Or you do this with each other. You both kind of hold each other on the scales, putting pressure on each other. And I think for a lot of us, this was what we would say is the symbol for work. And again, some of that makes sense, right? Like you get what you deserve. And yet, if you spend most of your life working and your value and worth is determined by the scales, it can be exhausting. And I think if we were honest, we'd say for a lot of history, this would be the symbol of the church. Some of you grew up in a church of scales where it felt like every week the pastor, preacher got out the scales and said, "You're not getting it done." And you tried hard, but you felt overwhelmed with guilt and shame, and it was never enough. Or maybe you did something that was so bad enough that you didn't think you could ever do enough good to somehow even it out, and you weren't kicked out of church, but you knew and everybody else knew you were never going to do enough good to somehow balance it. And so that became the symbol of your faith, and it just was too exhausting and it was too much, and you walked away from it. Like life on the scales sounds okay for other people, but when we're talking about ourselves and we know how often we come up short, eventually the scale approach to life leaves us feeling pretty lonely, pretty discouraged. It causes us to build up walls of shame and guilt because we know who we are and we know what we've done. Ultimately, the scales tell the story that we are not worthy. And so this was the approach that the Romans took to life. It's kind of our Western world approach. And Paul's going to talk to us about not living life by the scales as we study the book of Romans.